The crisp morning air usually brought peace to my little corner of tranquil pines, but today it vibrated with a different energy, one that hummed with disbelief and a tremor of satisfaction. Standing on my porch, squinting against the rising sun, I watched as Brenda, the HOA president, her face a mask of furious indignation, clutched a crumpled paper in her trembling hand. "You did what?" she shrieked, her voice echoing across the perfectly manicured lawns. Just yesterday, she had delivered a certified letter, a cruel, official decree giving me a mere 48 hours to demolish my beloved cabin. My cabin, a haven of handcrafted wood and cherished memories, was deemed an unapproved structure by her arbitrary ruling. "Demolish it, Alex," she had stated with icy calm, "or face immediate legal action and crippling fines." But now, it was her turn to crumble. I had just informed her, with a politeness that clearly infuriated her more than any shout could, that her monthly rent would be increasing by a staggering $450,000. Her eyes, usually narrowed in judgment, were wide with a dawning horror. A faint gurgling sound escaped her throat. The paper fell from her grasp, fluttering like a wounded bird to the ground. She stared at me, then at the letter, then back at me, as if trying to reconcile the mild-mannered neighbor she thought she knew with the person who had just dropped a financial atom bomb on her life. What she didn't know, what no one in Tranquil Pines knew, was the quiet truth behind my seemingly simple life, a truth that was about to turn her carefully constructed world upside down. How could I, Alex, a man who spent his days tending to a small garden and volunteering at the local animal shelter, wield such power? The answer lay buried deep in the history of Tranquil Pines, a history Brenda had overlooked in her relentless pursuit of control. My story in Tranquil Pines began not with conflict, but with a quiet sense of belonging. I had arrived in the community nearly 5 years ago, after my grandmother, Amelia, passed away. She had left me her small, rustic cabin, nestled on a generous plot of land that bordered a shimmering creek. It wasn't the biggest house in Tranquil Pines, nor the most modern, but it held a warmth and character that spoke of a life well lived. Grandma Amelia was a woman of quiet strength and boundless kindness. She believed in community, in looking out for your neighbors, and in finding joy in the simple things. Her cabin, which she had personally helped build with my grandfather decades ago, was a testament to that philosophy. Every plank, every windowpane, seemed to whisper tales of laughter and love. For me, coming from the bustling city, it was a sanctuary. I quickly settled into a routine that revolved around the rhythm of nature. I spent my mornings tending to Grandma's neglected flower beds, bringing them back to vibrant life. In the afternoons, I'd often walk through the neighborhood, greeting passers-by, or head down to the creek to simply sit and listen to the water. I wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, I actively sought peace. My dream was to make the cabin a place where children from the local orphanage, the Sunnybrook home, could visit for a day, experience nature, and just be kids, away from the concrete walls. I had already started building a small, simple wooden playhouse by the creek, thinking it would be perfect for their visits. It was modest, charming, and certainly not a cabin in the sense Brenda would later interpret. Life in Tranquil Pines was mostly uneventful in those first years. Neighbors were friendly, waving as they passed, sometimes stopping for a chat about the weather or local events. The HOA, then led by Mr. Henderson, a retired history professor, was a laid-back affair. Rules were enforced with a gentle hand, focusing more on community harmony than strict adherence to minute details. "We're here to help, not to hinder," he'd always say. I appreciated that. I focused on small improvements to Grandma's cabin, always mindful of maintaining its original charm. I repaired a leaky roof, repainted the porch swing, and even planted a small vegetable patch, sharing the bountiful harvest with my neighbors. Sarah, who lived 2 houses down, often traded me her homemade apple pies for my fresh tomatoes. David, across the street, a retired carpenter, helped me fix a stubborn squeak in the floorboards, refusing any payment beyond a warm cup of coffee. These interactions, these small acts of reciprocal kindness cemented my belief that I had found my true home. However, the tranquility began to ripple with the arrival of Brenda Maxwell. She moved into the largest, most modern house on the highest hill in Tranquil Pines, a gleaming monument of glass and steel that seemed to shout its presence rather than blend in. From the moment she stepped out of her luxury sedan, Brenda exuded an aura of self-importance and unyielding resolve. Within 6 months, she had orchestrated a campaign to oust Mr. Henderson from the HOA presidency, citing his lax leadership and outdated policies. Her arguments, delivered with sharp words and a perfectly coiffed blonde bob, swayed enough of the more impressionable or easily intimidated residents. Many, like Sarah and David, felt uneasy but were too polite or too exhausted to challenge her. Soon, Brenda Maxwell was at the helm, and the Tranquil Pines began to feel like a cruel joke. Her reign started subtly enough. New flyers appeared in mailboxes, detailing stricter lawn maintenance rules. Fines for unapproved paint colors were suddenly levied. Previously ignored sheds now required architectural review. The friendly community gatherings dwindled, replaced by tense, formal HOA meetings where Brenda lectured residents on conformity and property values. I, like many others, found her policies annoying but tried to stay out of her way. My little cabin, with its slightly mismatched charm, seemed to avoid her direct scrutiny, at least initially. I continued my work on the playhouse, a simple structure, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, with a small porch and a pitched roof. It was painted a cheerful pale yellow, a color I knew Grandma Amelia would have loved. The sound of my hammer, usually a pleasant backdrop to the neighborhood's quiet, now felt slightly defiant. One sweltering afternoon, while I was nailing the final shingle on the playhouse roof, a shadow fell over me. I looked down to see Brenda, impeccably dressed despite the humidity, standing with her arms crossed. Her eyes, magnified by her designer glasses, scanned the playhouse with an expression of intense disapproval. "Alex," she began, her voice a cultivated purr that barely masked her irritation, "what exactly is this structure?" I explained my idea about the Sunnybrook Home children, how a little playhouse would bring so much joy to kids who rarely got to experience a backyard. I even offered to host an HOA picnic at the creek when it was finished, so everyone could see how wonderful it was. A flicker of something, disdain? Suspicion? Crossed her face. "Interesting," she said, her tone utterly devoid of interest. "You understand, of course, that all exterior additions require prior HOA approval. And a permit from the county. And an architectural review committee inspection." She rattled off a list of regulations that sounded increasingly daunting. I assured her I'd look into everything, genuinely believing it would be a simple formality given the small scale of the project and its benevolent purpose. But for Brenda, nothing was simple. The playhouse, my small act of kindness, became her new fixation. Daily, I'd receive official-looking emails from the HOA, requesting documents, plans, and permits I didn't even know existed for a structure that was essentially a glorified shed. Each email ended with a veiled threat of non-compliance penalties. I spent hours at the county office, pulling my hair out over bureaucratic forms, and countless more on the phone with the HOA's appointed Architectural Review Committee, which seemed to consist solely of Brenda and her equally stern-faced crony, Doris. They demanded blueprints drawn by a licensed architect, a detailed landscaping plan for the area around the playhouse, and even a noise impact assessment. For a playhouse. It was ludicrous, a clear attempt to drown me in paperwork until I gave up. My patience, usually a deep well, was starting to run dry. I tried reasoning with Brenda, explaining the humanitarian aspect, the positive PR for the community. I even invited her to the Sunnybrook home to see the children, hoping a little empathy might soften her. She declined, citing a prior engagement that sounded suspiciously like a spa day. "Rules are rules, Alex," she had declared, her lips forming a thin, unyielding line. Sentimentality has no place in property management. Despite the escalating harassment, I refused to abandon my project. The smiles I envisioned on those children's faces were worth every frustrating phone call and every ridiculous form. I managed to get most of the paperwork in order, albeit weeks behind Brenda's arbitrary deadlines. The county approved the simple structure, confirming it needed no complex permits. But the HOA, under Brenda's iron fist, remained unyielding. Then came the formal hearing. It was held in the cramped HOA meeting room, a place that had once hosted friendly potlucks. Now, it felt like a courtroom. Brenda sat at the head of the table, flanked by Doris and a bewildered-looking new board member, Kevin, who seemed terrified to speak. I presented my case, clearly and concisely, with all the approved county documents. I showed pictures of the playhouse, explained its purpose, and even brought a handwritten thank you note from one of the Sunnybrook home children, a drawing of a stick figure smiling in front of a yellow house. My hope was that the sheer innocence of the project would disarm them. It worked on Kevin, who actually smiled. But Brenda and Doris remained impassive. Brenda, after a dramatic pause, announced, "While we appreciate your philanthropic endeavors, Mr. Thompson, the fact remains that this structure was initiated without proper HOA approval. Furthermore, our architectural guidelines explicitly state that all detached structures, regardless of size or intent, must maintain the aesthetic integrity of the community. Your cabin," she stressed the word with derision, "does not conform." She then brandished a thick binder, flipping through pages with a flourish. Page 47, Section B, Subsection 3, any unapproved detached dwelling or recreational structure, not in compliance with the aesthetic and structural guidelines, is subject to immediate removal. And since it is clearly a dwelling for children, it falls under this. My playhouse was a dwelling? The absurdity was breathtaking. The meeting concluded with Brenda stating that the board would deliberate. I left feeling defeated but not entirely surprised. I knew Brenda wouldn't back down easily. What I didn't expect was the swiftness and brutality of her next move. The very next morning, the certified letter arrived. I recognized the official HOA letterhead, the stark black font, even before I opened it. My heart sank as I read the words, "Notice of Non-Compliance and Order for Demolition." It cited numerous and egregious violations of HOA covenants and bylaws, specifically mentioning the unauthorized structure, my playhouse, now officially a cabin, in her eyes, and its blatant disregard for community aesthetics. The final, chilling sentence, "You are hereby ordered to commence demolition of the aforementioned cabin within 48 hours of receipt of this notice. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal action, daily fines of $1,000, and potential forced demolition at your expense. 48 hours. 2 days to tear down something I had built with love, for children who needed a glimmer of hope." It was an extreme, vindictive act, clearly designed to crush my spirit and send a message to anyone else who dared to defy Brenda. My hands trembled as I folded the paper, a cold fury beginning to simmer beneath my usually calm demeanor. This wasn't about rules anymore, it was about power, about Brenda asserting her dominance over a community she saw as her personal fiefdom. But she had made one crucial mistake: she had underestimated the quiet man in the rustic cabin. She had no idea that her petty tyranny had just awakened a sleeping giant. The 48-hour demolition notice felt like a physical blow, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. For a moment, I just stood there on my porch, the morning sun now feeling harsh and unwelcome. The thought of tearing down the little yellow playhouse, a beacon of future joy for the Sunnybrook kids, twisted my gut. How could someone be so heartless, so utterly devoid of empathy? Brenda's decree wasn't about rules, it was about power, a cruel display of dominance. My first instinct was to fight, to call a lawyer, to rally the few sympathetic neighbors I knew. But then a different thought, a much older, deeper one, surfaced. It was a memory of my grandma Amelia, sitting on this very porch, her eyes crinkling with wisdom as she'd tell me, "Alex, honey, sometimes the loudest voice isn't the strongest. True power often comes from knowing what others don't." She had a way of seeing things, of understanding the hidden currents beneath the surface of everyday life. This memory, coupled with the sheer injustice of Brenda's actions, ignited a quiet resolve within me. I wouldn't just fight Brenda on her terms, I would play a different game, one she didn't even know existed. The key, I realized, lay not in legal battles over a playhouse, but in the foundation of Tranquil Pines itself. I spent the rest of that day not planning a demolition, but diving into old documents. Grandma Amelia, bless her organized heart, had kept everything. In a dusty old chest in the attic, tucked away beneath faded photographs and antique lace, I found it, a thick, leather-bound deed box. Inside were not just the papers for her cabin, but a stack of other documents, meticulously organized and tied with faded ribbon. These weren't just property deeds. They were original land grants, old town planning maps, and, most importantly, the foundational documents for the entire Tranquil Pines development. My grandfather, a brilliant but unassuming real estate lawyer, had been one of the primary developers of Tranquil Pines back in the 1960s. He hadn't just built some of the initial homes, he had, in fact, been instrumental in structuring the entire community, including setting up the original HOA. And as I slowly pieced through the brittle parchment, a breathtaking revelation unfolded. My grandparents, in their foresight and desire to create a truly integrated and sustainable community, had established a unique ownership structure for several key parcels of land within Tranquil Pines. They had believed in a system where certain common areas, and even some specific residential plots, would remain under a trust, with the beneficiaries being future generations of the founding families, or, in some cases, designated charitable foundations. My grandfather, knowing the value of ongoing income for community maintenance and future projects, had even structured certain rental agreements within the development. As I read further, my eyes widened. A significant portion of the land, including the very plot Brenda Maxwell's sprawling, modern mansion sat on, was not owned outright by her. It was leased. A long-term ground lease, yes, but a lease nonetheless. And the lessor, the legal owner receiving rent for that specific plot, was a trust. A trust that, upon the passing of my grandparents, had quietly and legally passed into my full control. Brenda, in all her self-important declarations about property values and rules, had clearly never bothered to dig deeper than her own carefully constructed facade of ownership. She had bought the house, yes, but not the land beneath it. The original land grant for her specific lot explicitly detailed a 99-year ground lease, with terms for rent adjustments. Adjustments that, I discovered with a jolt, were tied not just to inflation, but to a rather obscure clause allowing for equitable adjustments based on demonstrable community benefit or detriment caused by the lessee's actions. My grandfather, ever the visionary, had built-in safeguards to prevent exactly the kind of oppressive, self-serving leadership Brenda now embodied. He had wanted the original trust to have leverage, a way to gently guide the community towards kindness and mutual respect, or, if necessary, to counteract malevolent forces. The discovery sent a jolt of energy through me. This wasn't just about a playhouse anymore. This was about a fundamental imbalance of power, about Brenda's abuse of her position. It was about righting a wrong, not just for myself and the Sunnybrook kids, but for the spirit of what my grandparents had envisioned for Tranquil Pines. The original lease agreement for Brenda's property specified that rent reviews could be initiated by either party every 5 years, or, in the event of significant community disruption or documented breach of the cooperative spirit clauses. Brenda's actions, culminating in the demolition order, certainly qualified as significant community disruption and a breach of cooperative spirit. The base rent on her property was laughably low by today's standards, a relic of its 1960s inception, but the equitable adjustment clause was the key. It allowed for a one-time, substantial increase to offset proven damages or disbenefits to the community or its designated beneficiaries. And who were the designated beneficiaries? The community members themselves, and, specifically mentioned, charitable organizations fostering local youth. The Sunnybrook home was directly mentioned in an addendum. The next morning, the 48-hour clock still ticking, I felt a calm I hadn't known in days. While Brenda was likely gloating, imagining me packing up my tools to dismantle the playhouse, I was drafting a formal notice. Not a notice of compliance, but a notice of lease review and rent adjustment. I cross-referenced dates, clauses, and legal precedents. I meticulously calculated the potential equitable adjustment. The $450,000 figure wasn't pulled from thin air. It was a carefully reasoned sum, representing not just the cost of potential legal battles and the emotional distress caused, but also a significant contribution to the Sunnybrook home, directly linked to the very playhouse Brenda sought to destroy. It was a sum designed to be utterly unignorable, a sum that would shatter her world as completely as she intended to shatter mine. This was my quiet power, a legacy of my kind and wise grandparents, and it was about to hit Brenda like a tidal wave. Later that afternoon, a less extreme but equally telling event occurred. Sarah, my neighbor with the apple pies, knocked tentatively on my door. Her face was etched with worry. "Alex," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder, "I heard about the letter. Brenda, she's really gone too far this time." She held out a small casserole dish. "I made you some comfort food. I wish I could do more. So many of us feel this way, but she's just so intimidating." Her voice trailed off. I invited her in, genuinely touched by her kindness. "Sarah," I said, a faint smile on my face, "your casserole means more than you know. And don't worry, this isn't over. Not by a long shot." I couldn't tell her everything yet, couldn't reveal the secret leverage I held. The element of surprise was crucial. But her gesture, her quiet act of defiance against Brenda's reign of fear, reminded me why I was fighting. It wasn't just for my cabin, or for the kids, it was for the very soul of Tranquil Pines, for the gentle, supportive community my grandparents had helped build. Sarah's visit was a low point in terms of the community's morale, but a high point for my personal resolve. It reinforced that kindness still existed, hidden beneath the surface of Brenda's tyranny. The hours ticked by. I avoided answering calls from curious neighbors, knowing any hint of my plan would ruin the element of shock. I went about my routine, tending my garden, making sure my actions conveyed no sense of panic or capitulation. Brenda's car passed by my cabin several times, slowly, almost daring me to show signs of demolition. I simply waved, a polite, calm wave that must have baffled her. She expected despair, she saw serenity. This calm was my quiet rebellion. As the 48-hour deadline approached, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and a profound sense of purpose. This wasn't about malice, it was about balance. It was about showing that empathy and kindness, when rooted in firm resolve and unexpected leverage, could indeed triumph over petty tyranny. The next morning, the very morning of the deadline, I walked over to Brenda's mansion. The air was still and tense. I carried a single, official-looking envelope. She was on her porch, already on the phone, likely discussing my impending demolition with one of her cronies. She spotted me and hung up abruptly, a smug, triumphant smirk forming on her lips. "Well, Alex," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "I hope you've had a productive 48 hours. I'll be sending someone over to confirm compliance by noon." Her eyes flickered towards the playhouse, daring me to say I had started tearing it down. Instead, I simply extended the envelope. "Brenda," I said, my voice steady, "this isn't about the playhouse. This is about your lease agreement." Her smirk faltered. Confusion flickered in her eyes. "My lease? What are you talking about?" "I own this house." I smiled gently. "You own the house, yes. But you lease the land it sits on. And as the legal trustee of the Tranquil Pines Ground Lease Trust, I'm here to inform you that effective next month, your annual ground rent will be adjusted to a total of $450,000. Brenda's face drained of all color. Her jaw went slack. The smugness evaporated, replaced by utter shock. She didn't shriek then, a choked gasp escaped her instead. Her hands flew to her chest as if protecting her heart from an invisible blow. She looked at me, then at the envelope, then back at me, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrible realization. The carefully constructed world where she held all the power was crumbling around her, not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of a legal document. She stumbled backward, clutching the porch railing for support. This is impossible. She stammered, her voice thin and reedy, completely unlike her usual booming tones. The ultimate extreme event had just occurred. Her carefully built fortress of control, her perceived invincibility, had just been breached in a way she could never have imagined. Brenda's horrified gasp hung in the air, thick with disbelief. Her face, usually so composed and stern, was a chaotic mess of shock and fury. She clutched the porch railing, knuckles white, as if the world beneath her feet had just tilted. You can't do this," she finally managed to choke out, her voice raspy. "This is outrageous. I own this property." I simply stood there, calm and steady. "You own the house, Brenda," I reiterated, "but the land has always been part of a ground lease. And as of today, that lease is undergoing a substantial adjustment, as per the original terms. The notice outlines everything, including the specific clauses that permit this adjustment based on your documented actions causing community detriment." I watched as her eyes darted from my composed face to the envelope in her hand, then to the little yellow playhouse that still stood defiantly by the creek. The realization, slow and painful, was clearly dawning on her. The tables had turned, completely and irrevocably, in a way she never anticipated. Her power, once absolute, had just been revealed as a flimsy illusion. She stumbled back into her mansion, slamming the heavy front door with a resounding thud that echoed through the quiet morning. I knew she'd be tearing through the documents, frantically calling her lawyers. The chaos she had tried to inflict on me, she was now experiencing tenfold. It was a less extreme event in the grand scheme of things, watching her retreat, but it was a deeply satisfying one. The immediate confrontation was over, replaced by the quiet storm brewing behind her mansion's imposing walls. I walked back to my cabin, a sense of serene victory washing over me. The 48-hour deadline for demolition had passed, not with a wrecking crew, but with a simple, devastating legal notice. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. I knew this was just the beginning of Brenda's counterattack, but for the first time in months, I felt truly ready. The phone calls started almost immediately. First, it was her personal assistant, then her lawyer, a sharp-voiced man named Mr. Finch, who demanded to know what game I was playing. I calmly referred them all to the terms outlined in the notice, the original lease agreement, and the legal right to enforce them. "My lawyer will be in touch," I stated simply, ending the calls before they could devolve into unproductive arguments. The most telling calls, however, came from the other HOA board members, Kevin and Doris. Kevin, who had seemed so uncomfortable during the demolition hearing, called first, his voice a mix of awe and fear. "Alex, is this true? About Brenda's rent?" I confirmed it, briefly explaining that her actions had triggered a rarely used clause from the original Tranquil Pines charter. He sounded genuinely relieved, almost giddy. "This changes everything," he muttered, "everything." Doris, on the other hand, was furious. Her voice, usually a sharp whine, was now a shrill screech. "You manipulative little, how dare you? You think you can just blackmail Brenda? This is illegal. The HOA will come down on you with everything we've got." I listened calmly, then replied, "Doris, this isn't blackmail. It's a legally binding rent adjustment based on the original land lease, which your own HOA board, under Brenda's leadership, neglected to properly review. Perhaps you should read the foundational documents of Tranquil Pines more carefully. Your loyalty to Brenda might be costing you more than you realize. That silenced her. I knew Doris was Brenda's staunchest ally, but her allegiance was rooted in self-interest and fear. The thought of losing her comfortable position, or perhaps even facing some indirect financial consequence, was enough to make her hesitate. The shift in dynamics was palpable, even over the phone. Brenda's grip on the HOA was already weakening, not through direct confrontation, but through the quiet, legal leverage I had exposed. A few days passed in a strange calm. The yellow playhouse stood proudly by the creek, untouched. Brenda remained holed up in her mansion, no doubt plotting her next move. The usual daily HOA emails had stopped. The neighborhood felt lighter, as if a collective breath was being held. Sarah dropped by again, this time with a beaming smile. "Alex," she whispered, "everyone's talking. No one knows exactly what happened, but Brenda hasn't been seen out, and Doris looks like she's swallowed a lemon. Whatever you did, thank you. The air just feels clearer." Her words were a small, quiet victory, a confirmation that my actions, though drastic, were restoring a sense of balance to the community. But Brenda Maxwell was not one to concede defeat quietly. Her silence was merely a prelude to a storm. An extreme event was brewing, one designed to hit me where she thought I was weakest, my reputation and my perceived financial standing. I received a new notice, delivered by a menacing-looking process server. This wasn't from the HOA this time, it was from a prestigious law firm in the city, representing Brenda. The notice was a lawsuit. Not just any lawsuit, but one alleging defamation, emotional distress, and unlawful business practices related to the ground lease. The amount she was suing me for? A staggering $2 million. And buried within the legal jargon, there was a secondary, more insidious claim, a petition to have the Tranquil Pines Ground Lease Trust, the very entity that gave me my power, declared invalid and dissolved, alleging improper management and conflict of interest. This wasn't just a threat, it was a full-scale assault, a desperate attempt to not only nullify my leverage but also to bankrupt me and reclaim her perceived control. The battle, I realized, had just begun in earnest. The lawsuit landed like a lead weight in my lap, not just a threat, but a calculated assault. $2 million, along with a move to invalidate Grandma Amelia's meticulously planned trust. Brenda wasn't just fighting for her rent, she was fighting to erase my family's legacy, to sever my last tangible connection to their vision for Tranquil Pines. The stakes had suddenly skyrocketed. This was no longer just about a playhouse or a rent increase. It was a battle for the very foundation of the community my grandparents had helped build. Brenda aimed to crush me financially and legally, leaving no doubt who held the true power in her eyes. Despite the staggering amount and the aggressive legal language, a strange calm settled over me. This was the moment of truth. My grandparents had faced their own battles, always with quiet dignity and unwavering principle. I would do the same. My first call was to a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but one specializing in trust law and real estate, someone who understood the intricacies of historical land deeds. I found Ms. Albright, a formidable woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and a reputation for winning. I laid out the entire story, from Grandma Amelia's cabin to Brenda's demands, and finally, to the lawsuit. Ms. Albright listened patiently, occasionally scribbling notes, her gaze sharp and intelligent. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Thompson," she stated, "this is an aggressive move by Ms. Maxwell, but it's not unassailable. Your grandparents were remarkably astute. The Tranquil Pines Ground Lease Trust is legally sound, and the clauses regarding rent adjustment and community detriment are crystal clear. We have a strong case, especially given the documented history of Ms. Maxwell's actions with the HOA." Her confidence was reassuring. This less extreme event, the meeting with my lawyer, was crucial. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it provided the bedrock for the fight ahead, shifting my focus from shock to strategy. The legal proceedings began. There were endless filings, discovery requests, and depositions. Brenda's legal team, clearly well-funded, tried every trick in the book to discredit me and the trust. They tried to portray me as a reclusive eccentric, manipulating old documents for personal gain. They argued that the ground lease was an outdated, unenforceable relic. I spent hours with Ms. Albright, sifting through more of Grandma Amelia's meticulously kept records, unearthing every single document that bolstered our case. We found correspondence, old community meeting minutes, and even newspaper clippings detailing my grandfather's original vision for Tranquil Pines, a vision that explicitly included provisions for community well-being and the careful management of shared resources. Every piece of paper was a testament to their foresight and integrity. Meanwhile, Brenda's behavior in the community became increasingly erratic. She was rarely seen outside her mansion, but when she was, her interactions were clipped and hostile. She doubled down on her HOA rules, sending out even more draconian notices about everything from recycling bin placement to acceptable shrub heights. It was a desperate attempt to reassert control, but it only served to further alienate the residents. The neighborhood WhatsApp group, once quiet, was now buzzing with complaints and hushed conversations about Brenda's meltdown. People who had previously been too intimidated to speak up were now openly grumbling. Sarah and David, my kind neighbors, continued to offer their quiet support, often bringing over homemade meals or just stopping by for a comforting chat. Their solidarity, though unspoken in public, was a constant reminder of the true spirit of Tranquil Pines. One afternoon, a surprising visitor arrived, Kevin, the HOA board member. He looked nervous, wringing his hands. "Alex," he began, I need to tell you something. Brenda and Doris are planning to call an emergency HOA meeting. They're going to propose a motion to formally condemn your cabin as a public nuisance and push for an injunction to force its immediate demolition, regardless of the lawsuit. They think if they get the whole HOA to agree, it'll look bad for you in court. This was a clear escalation, an extreme event designed to circumvent the ongoing legal battle. Brenda wasn't waiting for the court to rule, she was trying to use the HOA as a weapon to achieve her goal through a different avenue. The desperation in her actions was palpable. It also showed how truly vindictive she was, still fixated on that small playhouse, even while facing a monumental legal battle over her own home. The information was a crucial heads-up, giving me time to prepare for the ambush. I thanked Kevin, appreciating his courage to speak out. The battle was moving from the courtroom back to the heart of the community, and I knew I had to be ready to stand firm once again. Kevin's warning about the emergency HOA meeting sent a cold jolt through me. Brenda's desperation was growing, and she was clearly willing to drag the entire community into her personal vendetta. An emergency meeting, a motion to condemn my cabin as a public nuisance, it was a classic power play, designed to create a unified front against me and undermine my legal standing. She wanted to turn the neighbors into her unwitting pawns. This was an extreme event, a direct confrontation that I couldn't avoid. I knew I had to be strategic, to counter her aggression with the quiet strength my grandparents had taught me. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit, it was about protecting the soul of Tranquil Pines, about showing that kindness and community spirit could overcome malice and control. The emergency meeting was set for that Saturday, in the community clubhouse. The air inside was thick with tension, a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and whispers. Brenda stood at the podium, flanked by Doris, her face a mask of righteous indignation. Kevin sat further down, looking distinctly uncomfortable. The room was packed, more residents present than I had ever seen at a regular HOA meeting. Brenda began her address with a dramatic flourish, painting a picture of my cabin as a blight on the community, a defiance of their sacred rules, and a threat to property values. She exaggerated every minor detail, twisting my efforts to create a peaceful haven into a selfish act of rebellion. She even brought up the ongoing lawsuit, portraying herself as the victim of my unscrupulous tactics regarding the ground lease. Her voice boomed, full of practiced outrage. When it came time for me to speak, I walked to the podium with a quiet demeanor. I didn't shout or accuse. Instead, I spoke calmly, my voice steady, reminding everyone of the true purpose of my little yellow playhouse, for the children of the Sunnybrook home. I described the joy it would bring, the small piece of nature they rarely got to experience. I spoke of Grandma Amelia's vision for Tranquil Pines, a place built on community, respect, and mutual support, not on fear and rigid control. I showed them photos of the happy children from the orphanage. I then gently, but firmly, addressed Brenda's allegations. My cabin, this little playhouse, I stated, gesturing towards the clubhouse window where it was just visible, is not a nuisance. It is a symbol of kindness. The true nuisance, perhaps, is the fear that has crept into our community, the constant threats and arbitrary rules that have replaced neighborly goodwill. I didn't mention the lease or the rent publicly yet. The time wasn't quite right. I simply appealed to their common sense and their inherent decency. My words seemed to resonate. I could see the shifts in the audience, nods from some, thoughtful expressions from others who had previously seemed resigned. Sarah and David gave me encouraging smiles. Brenda, however, bristled, her eyes narrowing. She quickly moved to table the discussion, pushing for a vote on her motion to condemn the cabin. All in favor of deeming Mr. Thompson's cabin a public nuisance and pursuing its immediate demolition, raise your hands, she demanded. A scattering of hands went up, mostly from her direct allies and those easily swayed. But a significant number hesitated. This was the low point, the moment when the community had to choose between fear and kindness. Then, a less extreme event occurred, but one that subtly shifted the tide. Kevin, the nervous board member, cleared his throat. Madam President, he said, his voice shaky but firm, before we vote, I think it's only fair that we acknowledge that Mr. Thompson has made considerable efforts to comply with county regulations for his structure. And the intent behind it is clearly benevolent. Perhaps we should consider finding a compromise, rather than immediate condemnation. His words, though tentative, chipped away at Brenda's narrative. Other residents, emboldened by Kevin's dissent, began to murmur. What about the kids? Someone called out. Can't we just find a solution? Another added. Brenda's face darkened, but she couldn't silence the growing unrest. The vote was no longer a foregone conclusion. The meeting ended without a clear victory for Brenda. The motion to condemn the cabin did not pass overwhelmingly as she had intended. The vote was split, with many abstentions. It was a partial victory for me, a small crack in Brenda's armor. She was furious, her eyes flashing daggers at Kevin. The immediate threat of the HOA collectively condemning my cabin had been defused, at least for the moment. But I knew this reprieve was temporary. Brenda would not give up. She had suffered a public setback, and that only made her more dangerous. My peaceful walk home was interrupted by a desperate phone call. It was a frantic voice from the Sunnybrook home. Mr. Thompson, the caretaker, Ms. Peterson, cried, her voice trembling, we just received a notice. The HOA sent a formal letter to our main office, stating that unless you demolish your unapproved structure by the end of next week, they will revoke the Sunnybrook Homes Charter for contributing to community discord and associating with non-compliant residents. They say if we don't sever ties with you, they'll launch a public campaign to have our nonprofit status reviewed. My blood ran cold. This was an extreme event, a low blow beyond anything I had anticipated. Brenda, unable to directly crush me, was now attacking the vulnerable children I sought to help, using their very existence as leverage against me. It was a vile, unforgivable act, designed to force my hand through emotional blackmail. Brenda had crossed a line, and she was about to learn the true cost of her cruelty. Brenda's attack on the Sunnybrook home children was a gut punch, a new low in her campaign of malice. Threatening a nonprofit, jeopardizing the well-being of innocent kids just to get at me, it was unforgivable. This was an extreme event, a despicable act that solidified my resolve. My quiet patience was gone, replaced by a fierce determination to not only protect the Sunnybrook home but to finally put an end to Brenda's reign of terror in Tranquil Pines. The game was over. It was time for her to face the full consequences of her actions. I immediately called Ms. Albright, my lawyer, explaining the new development. Her voice, usually so composed, held a note of genuine outrage. "This is an egregious act, Alex," she stated, "a clear abuse of power and a direct threat to a charitable organization. It plays right into our narrative about her causing community detriment. We will use this. This gives us grounds for an emergency injunction against the HOA and Brenda personally, preventing them from interfering with the Sunnybrook home." The legal wheels began to turn faster than ever before. This rapid legal response, while less extreme than a direct confrontation, was a powerful counter-move, a quiet escalation of the war. The next few days were a blur of intense legal activity. A mess. Albright filed the emergency injunction, citing Brenda's blatant overreach and the tangible harm she was inflicting on a vulnerable population. She also expedited a motion for summary judgment on the original lawsuit, pushing to resolve the rent increase and the validity of the trust as quickly as possible. The evidence was overwhelming: Brenda's documented history of hostile actions, the original trust documents, and now, her despicable attempt to leverage the Sunnybrook home. The court date was set for a week later. Meanwhile, news of Brenda's actions spread like wildfire through Tranquil Pines. It wasn't just my little yellow playhouse anymore, it was the community's children being threatened. The whispers turned into outraged murmurs, then into outright condemnation. Sarah and David, along with other residents, began circulating a petition, not just against Brenda's latest move, but calling for her immediate removal from the HOA board. The anger was palpable, a groundswell of righteous indignation that Brenda, in her insulated world, had completely failed to anticipate. The day of the court hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers, but with curious residents of Tranquil Pines, many of whom had come to show their support. Brenda was there, flanked by her legal team, her face pale but still defiant. She shot me venomous glares across the courtroom. The judge, a stern but fair woman, listened intently as Ms. Albright presented our case. She detailed the history of the Tranquil Pines Ground Lease Trust, the specific clauses allowing for rent adjustments, and Brenda's calculated pattern of behavior. Then, Ms. Albright recounted the full story of the playhouse, its purpose, and Brenda's final, desperate act of threatening the Sunnybrook home. She presented the original letter from Brenda to the orphanage, a damning piece of evidence. Brenda's lawyer tried to argue, to dismiss it all as a misunderstanding, to paint me as a cunning manipulator. But the evidence was too strong, the paper trail too clear. When it was my turn to speak, I simply described the joy the playhouse was meant to bring, the innocence of the children, and how deeply saddened I was that anyone would try to hurt them for personal gain. I spoke of Grandma Amelia's legacy, her belief in kindness, and the true spirit of community. My words were quiet, but they resonated. The judge, after hearing all arguments, delivered her verdict. It was swift and decisive. She ruled in favor of the Tranquil Pines Ground Lease Trust, affirming its validity and my right to manage it. She found Brenda Maxwell's actions to be vexatious and retaliatory, deeming the $450,000 rent adjustment reasonable and equitable given the demonstrable detriment caused to the community and its designated charitable beneficiaries. The lawsuit Brenda had filed against me for $2 million was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she couldn't refile it. But the biggest blow, the extreme event that shattered Brenda's world, was yet to come. The judge issued a permanent injunction, preventing Brenda, the HOA, or any of their agents from ever interfering with the Sunnybrook home again. Furthermore, due to her egregious conduct, Brenda was immediately and permanently barred from holding any position of power within the Tranquil Pines Homeowners Association. Brenda's face crumpled. The last vestiges of her defiance vanished, replaced by pure, unadulterated devastation. She looked as if she had been struck by lightning. The noise in the courtroom was a collective gasp, followed by murmurs of quiet satisfaction. She stumbled out of the courtroom, her lawyers trailing behind her, their faces grim. The battle was over. That evening, as the sun set over Tranquil Pines, casting long shadows across my yard, the little yellow playhouse glowed softly. It stood, not just as a playhouse, but as a monument to kindness, resilience, and the quiet power of truth. The HOA meeting the following week, with Brenda conspicuously absent, was a stark contrast to her previous iron-fisted gatherings. Kevin, now the interim president, proposed a motion to formally apologize to the Sunnybrook home and to officially welcome the playhouse as a cherished community asset. It passed unanimously. The residents, finally free from Brenda's oppressive control, felt a renewed sense of camaraderie. Sarah brought over a huge apple pie, and David even helped me put up a small, hand-painted sign on the playhouse, Amelia's Welcome House. As for Brenda, her world truly imploded. With her legal battles lost and her authority stripped away, the relentless burden of her new rent became undeniable. The $450,000 annual lease payment for her land, now a legal fact, was astronomical. Stories began to circulate: her luxury car was gone, her carefully manicured lawn was growing shaggy, and the grand mansion, once a symbol of her power, now seemed to loom silently, a monument to her downfall. The community, once coward, now watched with a detached, almost pitying, gaze. It was a wild, unexpected ending, orchestrated not by vengeance, but by the quiet, unwavering principles of a man who simply wanted to build a playhouse, and the powerful legacy of those who believed in a community built on kindness, not control.